Hi, and welcome to Chapter 3. Today we'll be talking about the external environment, particularly political, legal, and economic forces. Now, the external environment is sometimes can go by this acronym PEST: political, economic, social, and technological factors. This chapter, Chapter 3, we're going to talk about two elements of the macro environment. Political and legal forces we consider one element, they're closely tied together, and economic forces. In the next chapter 4, we'll be talking more about social factors and technological factors. Now, inside of the political legal framework is also global regulations and protectionism. Now, these two chapters, of course, make up the external environment that companies have to be aware of in crafting their strategy. And we can call this outside forces a macro environmental forces that are going to affect industries. It can affect different industries differently, but it's going to pretty much affect most firms within most industries at some level. Now, the focus of these two chapters is going to be primarily on industry, not individual firms at this point. And certain forces are going to be, certain industries are more heavily regulated, certain industries are more heavily affected by legal issues, and certain industries are more heavily affected by environmental issues and economic issues. So as we come across these different things, I'll highlight some examples of this. Now, other macroeconomic forces, sometimes we use the acronym PEST. Political factors, economic factors, social factors, and technological factors. So in crafting a strategic plan, companies should look to their macro environmental factors in considering what to do moving forward. So these forces these forces are definitely going to affect all companies. No one's really immune to these four forces because they operate and live and have to abide by their environment in the state, country, world that they live in. And there are different legal and political and economic factors that come on all of those levels. Now let's talk about the political and legal forces. Okay, so a lot of political environment in the United States is about elections. So elected officials can be influenced by lobbyists and by campaign contributors to enact or support certain positions within the political legal landscape. Now, so legislation can come from these elected officials that are going to affect companies. And then certain elected officials, like the president, can elect judicial, court decisions, and judges, and then they can make decisions that can affect companies as well and set rules. And of course, we have government agency activities that are going to affect businesses, such as setting regulations and standards. Let's talk about some recent U.S. legislation that affects companies. In 2002, we had the Pension Securities Act, and this was to give workers a little bit more control, a little bit more freedom and diversity in their investments, and give them better access to investment advice concerning 401k plans. Now, there's still a long way to go. This 2002 Act addressed some concerns, but overall, the 401k system has been failing many workers as opposed to the old pension system in providing enough money for them to retire. And the one reason is that people have to choose how much to invest and where to invest, and most people delay or put off those decisions, which really impact their ability to save. Now we also have the CAN-SPAM Act, which we talk about penalties for emailers, which we call spam mail. So this, of course, in 2003 they meant well to try to reduce or put some controls on excessive spamming, although enforcement is really difficult. But what occurred after 2003's email services, especially email services like Gmail, did a much better job blocking the spam and getting customers trained or consumers trained in flagging spam. And even today, you have they have better computer algorithms to detect and stop spam mail. But it still gets through, so we all have to do our point to flag or block spammers as it develops. Now, the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010 was a direct result of the Great Recession. So this act was to primarily regulate banks, but also financial markets and credit rating agencies to make them less prone to catastrophic failure, more restrictions on larger banks, and help protect consumers from being taken advantage of by these lending agencies, which happened during the Great Recession with aggressive mortgages and very aggressive credit card stances. In fact, they had one thing that has been done away with. Credit cards used to have something called universal default. So if you had 10 credit cards and 9 of them you paid on time, never missed a payment, and had good interest rates, but one credit card you happened to miss a payment, that one credit card would charge you a fee and then raise your interest rate. But then all the other credit cards, that credit card would tell all the other credit cards and they'd raise your interest rates on all other 9 credit cards, even though you were never late or defaulted on any of them. And that was a very unfair practice, and this 2010 was put in place to help make things a little bit fairer and keep banks from taking advantage of individuals, as well as making companies that are too big to fail a little bit more heavily regulated to protect our financial markets from another massive catastrophe like we had in 2008. The Net Neutrality Act of 2015, Internet service providers must enable access of all content and applications regardless of source, without favoring or blocking particular websites. And this was put in place to make the internet a fair and equal place. So, cable providers or internet providers couldn't pick and choose who they wanted to favor, and then of course, they would start charging. Netflix, if you want to have a strong position in our network, you have to pay X amount of money to make sure your content comes through the fastest. And this Net Neutrality Act was recently affected and changed by making less clear and less net neutrality. So this is a strong issue that has changed since 2015, and I think by and large we're waiting to see what happens and how this is going to affect. Hopefully, what we don't want is limiting our access, increasing our costs as consumers. So the FCC really needs to kind of look at this more closely for whatever changes they make to make sure that it doesn't adversely affect the consumer and give too many advantages to the companies. Okay, so government regulations, these can be very costly to firms, but sometimes that cost is worth it. Sometimes it is beneficial if it creates barriers to new companies to come into and compete. If it raises the economy, the barriers to entry. One thing that's often raised is the mileage standard of cars. President Bush raised that to maybe 35 miles per gallon, and President Obama raised it to 55 miles per gallon by 2025. And this could add cost to vehicles, but also would make it difficult for new car companies to set up shop and compete in the United States. Okay, Patent Protection and Affordable Care Act. Now, the Affordable Care Act, which has gone through some changes since it was originally enacted, this, of course, increased regulations on healthcare providers and insurance companies in the U.S. in an effort to lower costs and expand coverage. And the idea is, if you get everybody covered, and you have more people in the pool, then the cost per person would be less because it could be spread over among many people. And specifically, if you get more young people in the pool who use less healthcare, costs should come down. And of course, this is beneficial to hospitals because more people are covered and they weren't coming into the hospitals and being treated and not paying their bills. But then, in certain markets, there was inefficiencies and prices were increasing. So healthcare remains a very troubled segment for consumers in the American healthcare market, where the government is always continually talking about and hoping to make some sort of improvement in this area. Okay, political, legal forces. Let's give some examples. One is food consumption. In the United States, we consume a lot of processed food and at restaurants, and it's heavily regulated because we don't the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, is regulating the food consumption, and they want to look at things, prevent people from getting sick. So they want to look at things at fat and sugar content, calories at restaurants being displayed. They want to talk about genetically modified foods, what constitutes an organic food, what safety procedures companies need to take. So when food is looked at, a lot of regulations come to be in an effort to protect human life, to make sure the food doesn't get tainted or spoiled or contaminated. But lately, some new regulation may become developed, although because individuals are concerned about the welfare of animals and the treatment of animals and how they cage them, how they, how a big part of how they're treated is something that could be regulated in the future to make sure there's less animal cruelty or abuse in our livestock. Okay, if we look at the automobile industry, which is also coincidentally the industry that we're working on with the simulation, the auto industry has been, of course, heavily regulated. Before it was heavily regulated, many people died and there was a lack of safety features. And in the 60s, some courageous people like Ralph Nader took these issues to the government and to courts and successfully got motor vehicles to have safety belts and encouraged motor vehicles to have more safety standards and have better performance in crashes, and led to the development of some standardized safety features that are regulated by the government, and also helped to spur on as a competitive strategy, companies wanting their cars to be safer, developing airbags, anti-lock brakes, automatic stopping, different things like this. So the idea is we want these cars to be safe, and at the same time we want them to have less pollution. So the miles per gallon, and then also the air quality, and such things as mufflers, which prevents noise pollution, catalytic converters to prevent, I think that prevents environmental pollution. So there's a lot of regulation because cars are a huge industry and there's a lot of cars on the road, and we don't want them killing people or spewing out tons of toxic fumes and chemicals. And did you know they used to have gasoline that had lead in it, and cars used to emit lead as well? Well, luckily they stopped that. In 2009, they had this cash for clunkers deal, which was part of the trying to help the economy out. And the idea was turn in an old clunker to be destroyed with bad gas mileage and buy a car with good gas mileage, and you would get a significant tax credit. And this is a way the government can influence an industry. Okay, so as far as global trends, globally regulation and protectionism rose after World War II, and then gradually shifted towards freer trade in the late 80s through the 2000s. And the idea being that protectionism doesn't work, tariffs and tariffs on products generally don't work and wind up causing inflation and causing higher prices. So a gradual shift to freer trade has wound up to, over the years of the 80s to the 2000s, business and trade significantly increased dramatically once the barriers and tariffs and protectionism were removed and trade deals were created. Then much more business activity started to occur, and this escalated the global economy greatly. As an unfortunate side effect, it also greatly escalated global pollution, which we now face in terms of climate disruption, where these emissions of pollution and greenhouse gases, as far as 90% or better of all scientists agree that this man-made economic activity is causing climate disruption, which could lead to further political or environmental regulations on companies. And it already has occurred where companies have to control emissions or become more efficient in some way to help reduce pollution. Okay, so U.S. trends. In the U.S., the trend shifted back towards greater regulations in the late 2000s. Some of it sparked by the financial crisis, the election of Obama and other presidents after, that put in some change the landscape. Every time a new president is elected, the landscape of regulation changes based on their ideology and the political powers that be. And sometimes these regulations are beneficial, and sometimes to the economy, to the industry, to people's lives. Specifically promoting clean energy, reducing dirty energy like coal, can have a real impact. In fact, the U.S., when a lot of environmental regulation was being developed in the late 60s and 70s, and even in the 80s, America was very much polluted. The rivers, even the Hudson River, New York, Lake Michigan was spontaneously combusted into fire. Our rivers and streams and air quality was terrible. And then starting with Nixon, passed these Clean Air and Water Acts, and today the Hudson's now safe to swim in compared to 30 years ago, where it was toxic, a dump of chemicals, and the environment in the United States cleaned up quite nicely. Now, one consequence of these additional regulations on clean air and water is that some companies found it too expensive and they left and set up production in maybe China or Vietnam and export with them leaving the country. The pollution followed them, and countries like China became more heavily polluted. So it's interesting to see what the cause and effect is. And of course, when these industries do leave, like say a garment industry, which produces a lot of pollution, uses a lot of water. There are less workers for the economy it's leaving, but sometimes it's balanced out by the greater environmental improvements you get in an area. Okay, so economic forces, switching over to economic forces now. We have things like economic indicators, which a very popular one is gross domestic product. Now, gross domestic product is something that we will talk more about, but basically looking at all the goods and services produced in an economy. And other big economic forces are inflation rates, interest rates, and exchange rates. Now, when we consider, there's some key economic conditions that we must, consider when we're in business, especially international business. And when we look at the dollar, how it declines in value against other currencies, are going to have an expected impact on U.S. exports. So if the dollar declines, exports become less expensive, but imports become more expensive. So if the dollar declines, it's good for exporters, but it's bad for importers, and it's also bad for inflation. So a good economy is not, different industries react differently to economic forces. So if economy is really strong and doing well, that may not be so beneficial to pawn shops, discount stores, discount restaurants, or even universities, which tend to do a little bit better when there's an economic downturn. So you can see an economic downturn, people are going to use pawn shops more. People are going to trade down to discount stores or fast food restaurants, and people who are out of work may turn to education. So the economic conditions affect different industries differently. Most industries, do badly when the economy declines and do good when the economy increases. Now, if we talk about ecological influences, now we talk about influence of the environment and the welfare of people in relationship to the economic environment. So if these ecological influences put in new regulations and new costs, that can alter industries. So ecological forces are often intertwined with political forces, and governments attempt to manage economic development to address a lot of ecological concerns, because governments are concerned not just about the growth of businesses, but the environment and people's welfare. So ecological influences also do heavily contribute to the development and the enforcement of regulations, which is going to affect companies and generally raise their costs. Okay, so let's talk about climate change for a minute. Now, the idea is human activity, driving cars, burning fossil fuels, heavy manufacturing, has an effect on global, has a sustained effect on global weather patterns. And if you just look towards the scientists that have studied this, the overwhelming majority has said yes, there is a definite scientific connection between man-made activity and climate change. I like to call it climate disruption because it's not so much change for the good. In many cases, it's change for the worse. So now, the scientific concept here is that carbon dioxide is produced by this human activity, which is mostly driven by the economy. So firms and business submit a significant amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that carbon footprint is going to have an effect on increasing these greenhouse gases. So governments are looking to businesses to cut back or reduce their carbon footprints or their greenhouse gases to reduce the potential harming effect to the environment. So this is going to lead up to a whole host of new regulations, and a whole host of new costs for businesses. But if it winds up protecting or extending the life of humans on Earth, it may be well worth it. Now, critics have, questioned, this link between carbon, especially people who are very pro-business. They don't like this idea of adding extra cost to business, so they sometimes want to be critical of this link between carbon dioxide and global temperatures. And they say that Earth has gone through cooling and heating periods over the past amount of years, and that we shouldn't make regulations or hamper business activity based on something that we most likely have no control of, is what the critics would say. But regardless of what position someone takes on this issue, consumers expect firms to take reasonable action to protect the environment. So when you think about this, companies don't want to have a bad image, because sometimes bad image will lead to bad sales or protests, or people not feeling so positive about a company. So companies want to be seen as being proactive and helpful to the environment. Now, sometimes companies will do that legitimately, and sometimes they'll just put on an act. So some companies will advertise. We have British Petroleum changing their company colors to white and green to show that they're a green company, and they'll advertise that they do all this research in solar power and alternative fuels. But then if you ever really look at a company like that, you'll find oftentimes they spend more money advertising the fact than the money they actually spend on alternative fuels or on the environment. So companies sometimes will spend a lot of money to foster this image of being helpful or good, or contributing to charity, or saving the environment, or being helpful to animals. But in reality, they may just be doing that for their image, and they're not really being that beneficial to, they're not doing as much good to these concerns as they could. So okay, now there are plenty of case analysis that we could do to look at different aspects of political and legal effects, economic and ecological effects on companies and industries, and how these factors will affect the industry, affect the company, and how what's likely to happen in the future when these become adapted. And some of these issues we'll take up in the case study for this chapter, and also some of the discussion questions for this chapter. Okay, so that's all for chapter 3. I look forward to talking to you for chapter 4, which will be up soon. And thank you for your time, and go out there and make some businesses profitable.